Today, Sinclair News sat down with Reverend Dr. L. Ronald Durham, Senior Pastor of Daytona Beach's Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist Church. Reverend Durham is the organizer of the upcoming Justice for Trayvon Martin rally scheduled for Saturday, July 20th, 2013, at the corner of Orange Avenue and Beach Street in Daytona Beach. We thank Dr. Durham for speaking with us. All right, you are Pastor or Dr. L. Ronald Durham, is that correct?
Pastor L. Ronald Durham, Reverend L. Ronald Durham, either one, they all work.
Pastor, we are sitting in your office at the Greater Friendship Baptist Church, or is it Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist Church?
Missionary Baptist,
okay.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure that. We saw an article in the Daytona News Journal, as well as other online sites.
Yes.
Where you are forming or organizing a Justice for Trayvon Martin rally for this Saturday, July 20th. At what time is it to start?
It starts at 12 noon, and it will be held at on the corner of Orange Avenue and Beach Street.
Okay, and that's outside the 5th District Court of Appeals building?
Yes,
in
correct.
Daytona Beach?
It will be right in front of the court building, yes.
Pastor Durham, I'm going to ask you some questions. Some of them, I hope you understand they have to be asked for us to get a better understanding of where people are at.
Mm-hmm.
According to this report, you were on a conference call Sunday evening with Al Sharpton and others from the National Action Network.
Correct.
You are quoted in this article as saying, "Tonight, like many of you, my heart is broken for them and what they had to hear when 6 women decided that George Zimmerman had the right to profile, follow, and confront an unarmed 17-year-old boy, then take it upon himself to end his life." You're referring to Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, the parents of Trayvon Martin, to which we have repeatedly said our heart goes out to them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a parent, I could not fathom to even imagine what that pain would be like.
Yes.
But in your statement you said it was okay for George Zimmerman to profile. What specifically are you referring to as profiling?
Well, I didn't say it was okay for him to profile. What I said was...
that the jury had said it was okay.
What I said was what had been repeatedly stated by the prosecuting attorneys. All 3 of them repeatedly used the word profile. And if you notice in my statement, I did not say that he racially profiled him. I said he profiled him. And there's a difference. He looked at this young man and made several assumptions based on what he saw. And that to me is the definition of profiling. The word that I used was taken directly from the trial itself, and it was allowed by the judge for that word to be used in the trial. She prohibited them from saying racially profiled, and I did not use the word racially profiled in my statement.
Correct, and just so we're clear, I did not say that you did either. Okay.
So, having been an African American for 62 years, I do recognize when there are circumstances that are unique to an individual based on color. They're easily identifiable. And in this case, to me, there was obviously some type of profiling that was done by Mr. Zimmerman.
Okay. We've heard a lot in the last 17 months from both sides and even those in the middle. In this past week, since the jury verdict has come down, there's been a lot of people on all sides. You've got Greta Van Susteren, who interviewed Jasmine Rand, who is one of the Martin family attorneys, and basically took Ms. Rand to task for stating that her more important position, even more important than being an attorney, was a social engineer. I think you and I both will agree we're of the age to where we can remember it took a little while to get things communicated down the chain compared to what it does in today's age of social media. Has social media inflamed this? and distorted it, or has it allowed people to put out facts? And I'm going to ask you if you consider them to be facts, or as facts as individuals see them, to get this. And I want to go back to when you say justice for Trayvon Martin. I want you to try to give me what your definition of justice for Trayvon is.
All right.
Okay.
Well, if we're going to say that social media puts out facts, obviously that's something that is highly debatable. Social media puts out perspectives that are drawn by the individuals who post those perspectives on their given pages. And so I'm not going to be able to say that they're factual in every single case. Okay. However, I think there is value to social media. When we look at the way that information was disseminated 50 years ago, when Dr. King did the March on Washington, it just amazes me how he was able to organize a movement like that with no cell phone, no text messaging, no social media, but yet thousands upon thousands rallied on the Washington Mall. Social media has its value. I think in some cases, at least in this case, I think social media certainly has been used to have people vent those frustrations that they may have, and that's on both sides of the issue. Mm-hmm. Those who are in favor of the decision that was held down by the court, and those who had some issues with it. And so social media, depending on where you stand, you will find those that are supportive of you, and you'll find those who may not agree with your position. And I believe that it can be, if used correctly, it can be a great way of letting people know that there is information that you can search, you can find, that you can read, and in so doing educate yourself better on what the issue might be. And your second question was?
Well, I was going to say, I wanted to get back real briefly to
you asked me what?
Yeah, what, in your perspective,
Mm-hmm.
from where you're sitting today, and in organizing with Reverend Sharpton for this Justice for Trayvon Martin rally, tell me, what is, in your view, justice for Trayvon Martin?
In my view, justice for Trayvon has to take a couple of different, has to be looked at in a couple of different ways. One, justice for Trayvon has to be, in my opinion, that there is some accountability that we did not receive, or that was not given by the jury. When we look at what the circumstances were that involved Mr. Zimmerman making the critical decision that he made, which was to get out of his vehicle after being admonished to not take any position, in fact, specifically told, you don't have to do that. But yet he continued with what I believe was the circumstances that participated in the events leading to the death of Trayvon. Justice has to be, one, that there is some accountability for an unarmed teenager who had every right to expect that night that he could leave the 7-Eleven store and go back to the apartment where his father and his father's girlfriend resided, where he had every right to be at the invitation of his father. There had to be some expectation on Trayvon's part that he had the right to be at the Twin Lakes retreat. Based on those rights, in my opinion, being circumvented by an individual who took it upon himself to determine that perhaps he was not in the place where he should have been, based on the fact that he did not, as he stated in the trial, identify himself as a neighborhood watch person. He did all of the things that would have made any reasonable person feel fearful. Trayvon didn't know who he was. Trayvon had no idea that this individual was some kind of neighborhood watch person. And so I don't believe that anybody has a right to follow you. I don't think anybody has a right to confront you when you are abiding by reasonable rules for citizenship in this country. You're walking back to a place where you live. I don't believe anybody has the right to do that.
Okay.
And so justice for me is for Trayvon's rights that, in my opinion, were violated.
Okay.
That those rights need to be addressed.
Now, you said justice for Trayvon, in your opinion, would be some accountability that the jury did not give. There's been a lot of talk this week as far as whether or not the jury should be commended for doing the job that I think you and I can both agree was something that neither one of us would have wished upon anyone. But do we have the right to take and basically tell a jury of 6 people, technically 10 including the alternates, who sat through a trial from beginning to end that a lot of us did not sit through, and say that they did not do their job? Is it fair to those 10 people, and specifically those 6 women, for people to now be targeting them and accusing them of everything under the sun other than doing what they were charged to do?
Well, no, it's not fair. I have never charged them with anything other than doing what they were instructed to do.
Mm-hmm.
They were given a set of facts that were presented to them as evidence. They weighed those facts. They made a determination based on the judge's description to them of what the law said in that instance was to apply. They took those instructions. They certainly took ample time to examine, in my opinion. They didn't come back quickly with a verdict.
Okay.
I believe they did diligently look over and pore over information that was supplied to them. They sent a note to the judge requesting clarification on manslaughter. What is it? Based on the judge's response, which was pretty much the
initial instructions
mm-hmm. without much variation to it. They had in front of them what the law said they could do or could not do. Obviously, there were individuals in the room, based on what we now know, that the jury initially was split. There was at least one individual in the room who was a little more convincing, and that individual was able to bring those over who had manslaughter and second degree as their vote, their initial vote.
Okay.
And so that's how the jury system in America works. We have the best judicial system in the world. I wouldn't want to live in any other country with any other judicial system other than ours.
Okay.
And so I believe the verdict that they gave was as reasonable as it could have been given the set of facts that were presented to them.
Let's address the set of facts, because you and I both know that depending on who you listen to, facts can differ extremely. Let's talk about the prosecution, for example. Now, we reported, and just based on what we saw last year, that we felt Angela Corey's office was using the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman incident primarily for political purposes, because she was up for re-election last year. We did report that many believe that she overcharged in this case, thereby ensuring a defeat. Do you feel that the prosecution approached this from the right angle? Do you feel that attempting to do second-degree murder was basically ensuring that they would lose based on the facts?
I really couldn't speak to that issue, not being an attorney myself. I don't know what Ms. Corey's decision was for second-degree murder to be the initial charge, with the manslaughter being the lesser included. So I can't speak to what she obviously felt, that what she saw presented to her. She felt that it had enough evidence in order for her to make the call that she did,
Okay.
which was second degree as the primary charge.
I'm going to go back to something that you said and you clarified in this interview regarding profiling. And you have made it perfectly clear you have never once used the term racial profiling at all. The Martin family attorneys, as far as Daryl Parks and Ben Crump, and even the prosecution, are on the record repeatedly saying this case is not about race. Yet we hear people now pushing and demanding federal civil rights charges based on race. How is that possible?
I don't know if civil rights charges are based on race. Civil rights are civil rights for all Americans. And that's what I'm hoping the outcome of whatever the federal Department of Justice deems appropriate. I don't want to have it appear that civil rights are only civil rights for African Americans. That's certainly not true. Civil rights is universally available to any individual who is a citizen of the United States of America and should be expected. And so all I'm asking for in what I do as a leader here in Daytona Beach is for this rally that we're holding on Saturday to hopefully have some impact on Mr. Holder's decision to bring forth these particular charges in the case of George Zimmerman. I just believe that from a civil rights perspective, that should be now appropriate in a case like this.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering, in your rally on Saturday, are you prepared and willing to tell the participants and the attendees that this is in fact about civil rights and not about racial profiling? Because let's face it, Reverend Sharpton, just yesterday, and I don't know if you were at the convention in Orlando or not, I do know you are a member of the NAACP, but he stood there and basically said that this is about our children. And you have to understand, people right now are saying, if it's not about race, why do we keep referring to it in a racial context? How are we going to get past that if we can't even refer to it as it being a basic civil right of all and keep race completely out of it?
You have to bring some historical context to the question that you just asked.
Okay.
Without question, I would think all reasonable minds who have studied American history at any length would have to concur that we have had historically in this nation a division and a separation of our races, whether it be overt or covert. It is still existing in many quarters of society today. It would be nice to say, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We now live in this utopia where that no longer occurs. However, that is not the case. The case is we still have a disproportionate number of African Americans who are in the prison systems, who are charged for having minor amounts of crack cocaine in their possession, while others who have powder cocaine and more of it get significantly lesser sentences. We still have disproportionate levels of employment in most cities where the unemployment rolls are certainly heavily populated by African Americans and other minority groups. So this is a societal issue.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to ever get to the place where we no longer have to worry about it, we have to determine where does that have to start from. Does it start from the people who don't have the ability to make the changes that are necessary for this kind of activity to go on? Or does it start from the perspective of those who do have the ability to make the changes, for them to do what's necessary in order for the alleviation of some of the frustrations and some of the things that are obviously going on in America today? And I think the answer has to be that if you don't have a boat to bring cocaine here, but yet you're spending a disproportionate amount of time in prison because you have a couple of rocks in your pocket, and someone can bring several kilos into this country and find themselves with an expensive attorney that gets them a much lighter sentence, then I think that's where we have to start. We start with where is it emanating from? Is it emanating, are these issues that we're talking about emanating from the African American community, or are they historically what we find that has been part of our culture here in this nation, when African Americans were freed from slavery, and yet immediately thereafter they were suppressed in the rights that others had in this country. They were free, but they didn't have the rights that others had after their freedom was granted. We have systematically been kept from enjoying, in many cases, the full freedom that America says every individual is supposed to have. And so when you hear Reverend Sharpton saying some of the kinds of things he says, we have to look at it not so much in the moment, but I believe we have to look at it in the historical context of what African Americans have experienced in the United States.
I guess the reason I mentioned Mr. Sharpton's comments is because in the last year we've done several stories regarding his involvement in the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman case. Whether people want to acknowledge the reality, but when people go in and start trademarking names and phrases and slogans and put on those trademark applications that it is for the express intent of commerce, and then you identify the types of commerce that this trademark is to be used for, I think people would have to say, or at least I would hope that people would have to say, it raises a valid question. Are these attorneys and these spokespeople that say that they're out to represent the interest of Trayvon Martin, who can no longer represent his own, is it about money to them, or is it really about Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin losing a son? Is it really about Trayvon Martin being targeted, whether it's profiling, race? I was going to get back to that because you said that no one has the right to be followed or looked at upon as being suspicious. I live in the neighborhood of your church, okay? And I'm going to ask you, and please, this isn't a sandbag, but I'm going to ask you. I know quite a few of my neighbors in the neighborhood, and I'm telling you, if they saw someone that they didn't recognize walking between their houses, they would become suspicious. They would continue looking out. Now, I'm not saying they would follow them and pull out a gun, because I wasn't there on February 26th. None of us were. But where do we go in saying that it's okay for neighbors to be, watchful for each other, Where do we draw the line? How far is too far?
Well, that's a good question. And in this context of Trayvon Martin, the issue is that, in my opinion, the issue is that Mr. Zimmerman was given clear, precise instructions on not to follow Trayvon Martin.
And in that statement, you're referring to the dispatcher asking him, "Are you following him?"
Yes.
To which Zimmerman responded in the affirmative, and then the dispatcher stated, and I'm using their words, not mine, "Well, we don't need you to do that."
Correct. That's
Okay.
exactly what I'm referring to.
Okay.
That should have meant for Mr. Zimmerman, stand down, stay in your vehicle. You've already made the 911 call. There's absolutely no reason for you to do anything further. The police will be arriving, and they are trained professionals who will handle whatever the incident might entail.
Okay.
That didn't happen. Your question about, reasonably being suspicious of an individual. There may be some reasonableness if you are living in an area where the homes are all single family. There's a person walking between your house and another that you don't know. When you're living in a subdivision, which is primarily apartment style living,
Right.
there may be individuals daily that come to the homes of individuals that you would not know. And if you're uncomfortable with living in that type community, then you need to live in an area that's different from that.
That's actually a very fair response and a very honest one, and I appreciate that. You have been a member of the NAACP for approximately how long?
25 years.
Okay.
Roughly.
You referred to your age. I did not.
Okay.
I'm not going to repeat it.
Okay.
You definitely don't look it.
Well, thank you.
But I'm going to ask you, in the case of the Justice Department, you were talking about the injustice, the disparity between the numbers of African Americans in prison for drug crimes as opposed to any other ethnic group. And I have to ask, the Justice Department has recently set up and publicly distributed a call for people anywhere to submit anonymous information to them on George Zimmerman. Anybody that wants to submit a tip and say that they know of a racist incident or where based on their race, they were treated. Let's go back to the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement for a minute. At the time, I believe that those involved in the Civil Rights Movement, from Medgar Evers, Dr. King, I would be willing to bet yourself because you're actually slightly older than Nate, but we'll leave it at that. Where people thought that the Justice Department was maintaining secret files and people were anonymously, do you really feel comfortable with a Justice Department, especially now in this day and age of internet where people can anonymously say things and never ever have to put their name on it? Is that fair? Is that something that you think is adequate in reviewing the civil rights challenges to the Zimmerman verdict?
Well, first, I wasn't aware of any thing that the Justice Department had done in that regard.
Okay.
I was a little surprised to hear you say that is the case, and I'm certainly going to try to find out. I believe you, but I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
But I'd like to see that. Is it fair? I would say no. I do believe that if they're going to do due diligence in whatever investigation toward the violation of Trayvon's civil rights, it needs to revolve itself around the incident itself. and not delve into whatever the past behavior or statements of Mr. Zimmerman were. May he have in the past used slurs? I don't know. Only he knows that. But I believe that the Justice Department needs to do whatever due diligence they have to if they're going to bring forth a case, because you want the case to be based on fact and not supposition or innuendo, or anonymous people who never have to present themselves in public and defend what they've said. I think he's entitled to that. Mr. Zimmerman is entitled to that, to confront anyone who may or may not have something to say about him. And so from that standpoint, I'm not necessarily in agreement that they should pursue that kind of...
It's interesting with your response to that question, because I was going to ask you, the FBI and the Miami Herald has repeatedly reported, and I know it was reported last year before the trial even started to get underway, that the FBI investigated, and during their investigation found absolutely no evidence of racial profiling or racist activity. But I think, and I'm going to ask you to clarify this for me, your response to the first question regarding the Justice Department seeking anonymous input, you said that you think the Justice Department needs to concentrate its review and investigation specifically on the Trayvon Martin incident, as opposed to what has or has not happened in the past. Would that be a valid argument for those who say, well, look, the FBI has already said there's no racism here, so therefore there's no need for another investigation? You have openly and honestly said that you are not asking for an investigation based on race. You have specifically stated you have not said, nor will you say, that it is racial profiling. You've definitely demonstrated the difference between what people are saying and where you're coming from. I guess, as a minister, and you have been one for some years, according to your bio, I did my homework.
Okay.
One of my questions to all ministers and churches that are getting involved in the rallies across 100 cities is, how do you reconcile, like the quote, where you said that unfortunately 6 men, 6 women, or 6 women said it was okay for George Zimmerman to profile follow. That would appear to be a judgment that you yourself personally and individually have made, that you have judged Zimmerman to have profiled, followed, and taken. So how do you reconcile that with Christ, judge not lest ye be judged, with your congregation or with anyone who might seek your counsel on spiritual matters?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I believe that in the case of Mr. Zimmerman, he made the determination to put himself in a position where opinions about what he did are now coming forward. I did not place him in that position. He put himself in that position. If you don't want people to come to a reasonable conclusion about your actions, then one must do whatever is possible to do to avoid persons making those kinds of rational judgments. Yes, it is my perspective as a pastor to follow the biblical mandate, to judge not lest ye be judged. And I don't have the power to judge George Zimmerman, but there are those who do. We live in a country of laws. And one of the things that laws do is judge the actions of those who are under the laws of the land. What I'm asking for is not a judgment upon George Zimmerman as a personal indictment of him. What I'm asking for is for the laws of the land to determine if Mr. Zimmerman, in fact, did violate laws that were put in place in order to protect the civil liberties of every individual in the United States. I don't think that was the thrust of the trial that just ended.
Mm-hmm.
It did not come out in any way, shape, or form. But that does not mean that there were not civil liberties that were taken away from Mr. Trayvon Martin. And so my call is, let's look at it. If Mr. Holder determines, after sufficient investigation, that there is nothing there, we're satisfied with that. If he determines that there is something there, then I believe it's incumbent upon him and the Justice Department to take the next steps. And that will only be determined after they have had time to sufficiently look at whether or not this is going to take place. At this point, it's mere speculation, because based on the comments that Mr. Holder made at the NAACP convention, he does not seem at this point to be leaning toward going in that direction with civil rights violation charges. He seems more inclined, from what I read in his statements and comments, he seems more inclined to deal with the stand your ground laws. And so it is my hope that he can be convinced that perhaps there is something further to look at other than changing the stand your ground laws in those 22 odd states. And my number may be skewed.
I think it's 14, but you may be closer.
Okay.
I think they said 14.
Okay, well, my number may be off. But I believe it may be, that may be a more difficult place for him to begin the process than with seeing whether or not Mr. Martin's civil rights were violated. If he comes back to say, we've done our investigation, there is no grounds to bring any more charges, we'll be very happy with that, whatever that decision is.
I'm going to ask you, because people have, I'm sure you've heard the same thing. There's constant talk on all sides. This, Attorney General Holder is playing politics with this. There's people are saying he's giving those who want civil rights charges brought false hope, and people are questioning, by doing that, in their opinions, is this actually preparing and inflaming a situation that is only going to explode even worse? And I will be honest, I think that for the most part here in Central Florida anyway, I think the Martin family and those involved in questioning this case have done an excellent job at asking people and insisting that people represent with dignity and peace. But let's face it, there's some who want to play politics with us. And if the Justice Department comes out and says, I'm sorry, there's nothing there, what do you say? What do we do with those who want to use that as yet another excuse to throw something through the window of a police car or something? I mean,
well, our position has always been one of nonviolence. When I was involved in the rally in Sanford a year ago, where Reverend Sharpton spoke. In fact, I was the organizer of that rally.
Okay.
That was peaceful, with 30,000 people there, who could have easily been moved in a totally different direction if that was the intent. There was no intent then, and there is no intent now.
Okay.
The rally Saturday is only one of several steps that are going to be taken when the rally is over to educate our community. We, in this meeting that we just held today, we determined that after the rally, there must be next steps in place. And those forums will be to address several things. How do our young men respond when they are stopped by a police officer?
Okay.
How do they respond when confronted by someone that they may not recognize or know? How do we address the issue of understanding what our civil liberties are? In many cases, that needs to be educated as well. So we're prepared after the rally Saturday to begin the process of education, of bringing our young sons and young daughters into a place where we begin to show them how they carry themselves, how we as a community need to respond when similar situations like this may present themselves. And I believe that with the next steps that we're planning, it's comprehensive in that we don't want to get people together just to raise this as an issue and then to leave and nothing has been done. And we're back to where we were when we started. This process is going to begin a whole set of things that we begin to do in the Daytona Beach area that I will not necessarily be leading, but I want to begin the process of others who have far superior abilities to mine to come together and to plan the things that need to be done in our communities so that we can properly educate our young people.
I'm going to ask you a very difficult question now. The reaction to the jury verdict in the George Zimmerman trial. People immediately standing up. Reverend Sharpton, it's a slap in our face. Jasmine Rand, you know, the jury rendered its verdict. We don't necessarily agree with it. We didn't get justice for Trayvon. She even went so far as to say that Trayvon did not get a jury of his peers. Are we possibly blurring the line here between what the Constitution entails as far as justice for each and every one of us with what we might see socially as being the right thing to do? Do we really want to go to the point to where we say justice is supposed to be blind, but only blind when it doesn't affect us personally? Or do we want to keep that fine line in there to where justice is supposed to be, if you're accused, you have the right to be proven guilty. And it is the state's burden to do that. Are we possibly blurring that line there with this?
Well, my position has been, and I think from the article that you're quoting me from, my position has not been one of trying to taint the jury in any fashion. I've not made any statements about the makeup of the jury in the sense of what their individual ethnic background was. Would I have liked to have seen there to have been an African American on the jury, or perhaps two? Certainly. I would have loved to have seen that. Because I think when you're sitting in the jury room, what you're bringing inside that room are your cultural experiences. If you don't have in that room individuals who can speak to your cultural concerns, I don't believe in many cases there can be a full and complete dialogue about what other circumstances may have played a role in any case.
But as a minister, as someone who has been involved in the civil rights movement as long as you have, as a minister who knows all too well the numbers of African Americans in prisons and jails across this country, are you really saying that a jury is supposed to bring feeling and emotion into that jury room in order to understand what could have happened, rather than what the law says, which is you're supposed to consider the evidence as presented? Are we not asking that maybe we're going not so much from evidence, but how do you feel about this? Are you really prepared to say that maybe jurors...
That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, when the jury sat in that deliberation room, poring over each piece of evidence, I don't know what weight the jury gave to the statement that Trayvon allegedly made when he referred to Mr. Zimmerman in the terms that he did.
The creepy ass cracker.
Correct.
Okay.
I don't know what weight the jury gave to that.
Okay.
However, if that came into the discussion process, not having someone from the cultural perspective of Trayvon in the room, it can certainly lend itself to that experience not having an equal adversary, if you will, to argue against what that may mean from the perspective of his community. So when we look at a jury makeup, I do believe that it is important to have that jury look like America looks. And in this particular case, maybe that didn't happen.
Would it be fair to say, and I understand where you're going with this, I grew up in South Carolina.
Okay.
Okay. And I understand exactly where you're going. And if the jury was to have given any weight to Rachel Gentel's statement regarding the creepy ass cracker, I think you're concerned that maybe they gave it the weight that there's a racist. Mm-hmm. Because today's culture, and maybe that's something else that we need to address in this, because we do tend to have a culture that is divided along racial lines as to who can use certain words or phrases in communication. Mm-hmm. And does that not cause us all a bit of confusion and controversy? I can honestly say, a friend of mine asked me, he says, anybody that grew up south of the Mason-Dixon line in the 50s and 60s could not say that they have not at least once used the N-word. Mm-hmm. And I looked at him and I said, I can tell you I'm 51 years old and I can honestly say that it's never come out of my mouth. Mm-hmm. But I don't particularly like it when I'm walking down around friends who are using it as terms of endearment, because I think it does take away some of the very serious physical ramifications that people experienced in the 50s and 60s over getting that word out of the vocabulary. So where do we go from here as far as the culture?
Well, you know, the jury makeup, I think, is a key point that you brought up, that you raised. And mentioning Rachel Gentel is certainly a linchpin, I think, in, I hope it was a linchpin in their discussions. Because she stated that Trayvon said, "Get off me, get off me," which would have certainly indicated that what Mr. Zimmerman said was perhaps not the whole truth. And I wonder, in looking at Rachel from the perspective of them as a jury, looking at this woman who had her issues with communicating, but then saying to themselves that because perhaps she did not communicate to them in a manner that they deemed to be understandable, perhaps less weight may have been given. And had there been, in hindsight, had there been others who could have spoken to what her cultural background was,
Right.
It may have made things, I think, more easily understood. Here's a young lady that the perception was not very, perhaps, intelligent, which is the furthest thing from the truth. She speaks 3 languages. How many of us can speak more than English? You're better than I am.
No, I'm not.
I dabble in Spanish, but
Right.
I can't do it. But here's a young lady speaking 3 languages fluently, who is very intelligent. And I think the perception may have been, because of her presentation, that perhaps she was, in the sense of credibility, perhaps the weight may have been diminished because of the cultural differences that presented themselves during that trial. And it disturbed me then, and it still disturbs me now, because I wish that there had been more of a presence of one or perhaps 2 from the African American community. That doesn't mean that the verdict would have been any different.
All right.
But it just makes one wonder if there had been, that maybe the discussions would have lent themselves more to an understanding of some of the things that took place in the trial.
I'm going to try to wrap this up because I know I'm going way over what your secretary said you had time for, but I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions if you don't mind. One of them is going to be, we talk about what happens within the community, and I'm going to ask you to confirm we're referring to the African American community. And I'm going to ask you, why is it that we seem to have this drive, this desire for answers in Trayvon Martin, and yet we sit back and ignore the 14, 15, what is it, between 15 and 20 young African American men just in the south side of Chicago a week ago that lost their lives to gun violence. Are we doing ourselves an injustice by highlighting one and ignoring the other?
I have to answer that from a spiritual perspective. I do believe that God sets in place individuals that come across history who make an impact. That does not diminish what happens to others tragically in our country. But there comes times in history when the Rosa Parks come on the scene. There comes a time in history when there are people who affect it. And I believe that it is ordained and set in motion by what God intends to have happen as a result of it. And I do believe that in this particular instance, Trayvon was, and I'll use a Christian term,
Okay.
which was used for Christ. I believe Trayvon was a crucifixion victim who, as a result of his crucifixion, there are going to be many that are looking a lot closer at what the circumstances around the crucifixion were. When Christ was crucified, it was a common occurrence for people to be crucified. He was treated in many cases like many other crucifixion victims. But his crucifixion made a difference. His crucifixion for 2,000 years has still been the linchpin of the faith of millions of people around the world. And I just believe that God ordains and sets in place these unique situations where a Trayvon Martin comes along and we sit back and say, wow, there's something about this particular young man, not to diminish what happens in Chicago or New York or the south side of LA, but this particular young man becomes a symbol for taking a harder look at everyday situations and circumstances that we become anesthetized to because we just see them so often.
It's interesting that you answered that question with that response, because my next question was going to be, Attorney Benjamin Crumpt on Saturday night in the press conference by the Martin family attorneys after the verdict was announced made the statement that Trayvon Martin would forever be in the annals of history and the civil rights movement alongside Medgar Evers. And I will tell you, I had a problem with that. I will tell you that I have talked to at least 1,200 people since Saturday that I know are as active in the civil rights movement and were when it was, really the civil rights movement, to where you really did march down the street and hope like heck your head didn't get taken off. Okay? And they had a problem with that. They said that they thought maybe that was going too far. I'm going to ask you if I'm assuming correctly in saying I don't think you have a problem with that, not with the last answer.
As I mentioned, I just believe that there are figures that come on the scene and their lives impact us for generations to come. Okay. I believe that Trayvon fits that mold. I believe that somehow his name is going to be kept alive, if you will, and one that we won't forget, because I believe that there's going to come out of this some things that really have tremendous value to the African American community, as far as there being some recognition that we have to start changing culturally, and we have to start having an honest dialogue about where that begins, what it should look like, and what the ultimate goal and outcome is that we're seeking as a nation. Because I do believe that our nation is has its challenges in the area of race. It's not, I don't think that's something that is a profound, newly recognized statement, but unless we get to a point that we are willing to ask the hard questions of each other and learn more about each other, as long as we stay in our individual communities, isolated from one another, we are never going to get to the place where this young man's death will change anything.
You just touched on what I want to be my last question, unless you can think of something you would like to say that I haven't asked you, and that was, are we not doing ourselves an injustice? Are we ever going to get to the point to where you're saying that we impact each other's lives? As long as we do, and let's face it, we do tend to sit back in individual communities. Intentionally we identify ourselves as the African American community, the Irish American community, the Italian, the Mexican. Have we ourselves contributed to this cultural difference and divide, because we can't seem to come together and just refer to all of us as Americans. We tend to have that hyphenation there.
Well, I think that's a question that's been asked for several generations. But who has to initiate it? Can I go to a setting at a country club that is exclusive and say to that country club, I'd really like to become part of what's going on in this club? Or does it have to be the members of that club that say, you know what, we've kept ourselves isolated for so long, why don't we initiate bringing in others so that we don't have a perception of being this isolated community? In order for things to change that have to change, a great deal of the impetus is going to have to be on the dominant culture, reaching out to the minority culture and saying, let's have some conversation. Let's do the things that it's going to take to make this country what it was envisioned in its founding fathers, albeit some of them slave owners. But I believe they had a lofty idea of something that could be different. And the only way it's going to happen is if we can begin that process of talking with each other and not being afraid of each other. When I see you walking in this community, I don't automatically assume that either you're lost or there's something suspicious about you.
Right.
And so we have to get that dialogue started, and our mindsets have to be changed to accepting one another.
Pastor Durham, I want to first and foremost thank you for agreeing to sit down and answer these questions.
You're welcome.
Secondly, I want to thank you for being extremely candid and open and honest. I will tell you that I appreciate the fact that you clarified and pointed out that your definition of what you consider to have occurred as far as profiling, I think it takes a true leader and someone who is sincerely interested in the best interest of our community in admitting that, look, this is not about race, this is about something else. And I think that's where people need to, I think that's where we've got the divide on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank you for answering the question, because I posted in an article that we put up a couple of days ago on you and this
Okay.
on you and the scheduled rally, because I've gotten involved with a church in Orange City, and primarily because I admire the congregation and the pastor, because they truly are an open example of being an open church, no judgments, no preconceived notions. And when I read your statement from Facebook, I asked that very question: at what point do we reconcile the judge not lest ye be judged? And I think you've just answered that question.
Oh, I hope so. I certainly hope so. And thank you for taking the time to come and speak with me today.
I wish more people would take the time to go and speak with people. We might be doing a lot better off.
That would make all the difference in the world.
Pastor Durham, thank you so much.
Thank you.